Olá, sou Marcelo Lauer, sócio da Gran Rio Capital. Como membro do TMA, cumprimento a todos e registro minha satisfação em participar do nosso 13º Congresso, evento que se consolidou como referência na área de recuperação judicial e insolvência no Brasil. A essência do artigo 47, que justifica a adoção de medidas para a preservação da empresa viável, está intimamente ligada à perspectiva de continuidade, razão pela qual o painel fomentará a reflexão sobre um importante tema para os processos de recuperação judicial: Desafio do Plano de Credores, valuation das companhias. Acompanhe conosco.
Obrigado, Marcelo. Estão conosco aqui no estúdio, os estúdios da TMA, André Bedim, sócio Lobo de Rizzo, Advogados, de forma online, doutora Nelly Almeida, sócia Milbank, Renato Carvalho aqui conosco no estúdio, sócio Laplace Finanças, e na relatoria, Jarvinen, sócio Berger Singerman. O painel tratará sobre o tema Desafio do Plano de Credores, valuation das companhias. Você que está nos assistindo e quiser, o painel será transmitido em inglês, falado em inglês. Se você quiser a tradução, é só entrar na nossa plataforma e optar pela opção tradução. Muito obrigado, excelente painel a todos.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for the introduction. The main idea here is to discuss the challenges on the creditors plan, considering the valuation of distressed companies. As you already made a brief introduction of everyone, I think I'll just start with Nelly, which is online with us right now.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Nelly Almeida. I am a partner in the restructuring group at Milbank. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the Chapter 11 perspective, as I understand that some of the recent reforms that were made in the Brazilian law basically effectively expand and clarify creditors' rights and have some changes that are similar to how Chapter 11 works in the United States when it comes to those aspects. One of the key aspects of the law, my understanding, is the ability for the RJ process to now provide for a creditor's plan with a debt for equity exchange. And this change obviously raises a number of interesting questions, including what role valuation will play in the plan process. So again, I'll talk about the Chapter 11 aspect of it, which I think, and some observations that I have, which I think would be helpful as you think about the impact of the revisions to the law. I'll start very quickly with just explaining the plan process in Chapter 11, because I think it could be helpful context. As a general matter, in the United States, we've long imposed a balanced framework, which would provide a debtor in Chapter 11 with an initial period of plan exclusivity, whereby a debtor retains the exclusive right to file a plan of reorganization, at least for the first 120 days of a case, and that time can be extended up to 18 months from the filing of the petition date. The Bankruptcy Code also gives creditors in the United States significant rights to intervene, to try to intervene with motion, to pause the debtor's exclusivity, and ultimately terminate the exclusivity and file its own creditor plan. In practice, although the ability of creditors in Chapter 11 to object to the debtor's motion to extend exclusivity, or the ability to file motions to terminate exclusivity and submit competing alternative plans of reorganization, they're all very important points in terms of leverage during the plan negotiation process. But the reality is that the rights of creditors to propose plans of reorganization has not made debtor proposed plans irrelevant. The norm in the United States is still debtor proposed plans, and courts will often protect debtors that are indeed negotiating in good faith and fulfilling all of their obligations. However, even with a debtor proposed plan, the ability to have a debt for equity exchange in the US makes it such that certain creditors have a key role in the plan restructuring process. And these creditors are what we call here in the US the fulcrum security. The fulcrum security is effectively the piece of debt in the capital structure that's going to be converted into equity of a distressed company as it restructures its balance sheet. Said differently, in the United States under bankruptcy law, there's a hierarchy in who gets paid. Put simply, secured creditors come first, unsecured creditors come next, and stockholders are last in the waterfall, the tech waterfall. Senior creditors, there's a rule in the US Bankruptcy Code, absolute priority rule, whereby a senior creditor has to get paid in full before anyone below them in the debt stack receives anything under a plan. What this effectively means is that there's a creditor class somewhere in the capital structure that's partially in the money, partially not. And that is the fulcrum security, and that is the class of creditors that's usually going to equitize as part of a restructuring process. What this means is that that class of creditors has maximum leverage in negotiating, structuring, and leading the plan process, even if it's a debtor-led plan. Now, this sounds simple enough, but unsurprisingly, the complicated part is that valuation becomes key in this process, because who the fulcrum is and where value breaks depends highly upon what your view of valuation of the company is. And as we all know, valuing a distressed company there's wide latitude in how to do that, because there are some areas of discretion. You're making some discretionary assumptions, and it's dependent on the facts and circumstances. So this leads me to 3 observations that I think would be helpful in discussing this new law. One, as I'm sure most of you are aware, valuation disputes in Chapter 11 are not uncommon, especially when there's a junior class of creditors or shareholders who believe that actually they're in the money, and actually they're the ones who should be controlling the process, or they're the ones who should be equitizing in the event of a junior creditor. So it's important to keep that in mind. 2, shifting valuation. Valuation is tested at the time of the plan. So, and depending on facts and circumstances, valuation can shift significantly. So for example, if you think about a company who has a cyclical industry, or a business that's affected by volatile commodities like oil and gas, the valuation on day one may be X, but X months from now, that valuation may have shifted significantly. Similarly, one interesting thing we saw during the pandemic is you've seen companies that filed for Chapter 11, and at the time of the filing, depending on when they were exiting, maybe their valuation was low because they were in entertainment industry. And so it gave an opportunity for the fulcrum security at that time to equitize. However, we saw other companies file who maybe when they filed, valuation was low, but before they exited, there was a turnaround. Like you saw Hertz, a reorganization. When they filed, they were underwater. As the case went on, before they exited, it became clear that shareholders were in the money because the company's valuation had shifted with time. So it becomes an interesting negotiation of time, and nobody could predict how the shift is going to happen. No one predicted how 2020 was going to play out when the vaccine was coming out in the different valuation points. So you can't run your entire strategy based on timing. But as a junior creditor, for example, if you truly believe that the company is misvalued or management is valuing the company too low, and that you in fact are in the money, one way that people address that in the United States is by, for example, putting your money where your mouth is. Maybe you want to propose a plan where you put in X amount of capital and take out the senior creditors. That's one way to prove that the valuation is in fact higher and show your commitment to the company. And it's a strategy that some junior creditors will partake in. So this is all to say, and I can go on and on. I know that we have a timing issue. So I thought those were important points to make. And this is all to say that although valuation does matter in terms of understanding where the fulcrum security is and in terms of understanding which creditors are going to convert from debt to equity as part of the restructuring process, what we really see in Chapter 11 is that there's a lot of consensus building. Because regardless of where value breaks, you do often see creditors give something to equity, warrants, or something to junior creditors to buy peace, because valuation disputes can be time consuming, they can be complicated, and they can erode value. And sometimes it's more beneficial to kind of reach an agreement and settle somewhere. And that's where all of this is on, at least in the US. That's not to say that there aren't cases that get a bit litigious where there's vast disagreements in terms of value. But it is to say that it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in Brazil with the new law and the different complications of valuation and how that leads maybe for consensus, maybe not. We'll see. So, I'll leave it there because I want to leave time, if there's any questions at any point. I wanted to kind of walk through that context because I thought it would be helpful for everybody as they think about the implications of this new law.
Thank you, Nelly. Thank you for your words. I think here in Brazil, we had some scenarios that were pretty close to what you have been talking about, because not only we had the pandemic lately that actually stopped a lot of companies, but here in Brazil, we have a kind of history of financial plans that kind of went wrong for companies and made them, and from one day to another, they had like a huge debt that they had to deal with. Some of those companies actually sold their assets to actually cover debt during this kind of temporary problem. And some of them are actually with a lot of debt until today. And the pandemic actually gave us this new problem to deal with. And when it comes to valuation, entertainment is a very interesting aspect of this, because, well, you are actually fully stopped until you can have public again and you can have shows again. And while this is a problem for them, it was actually a huge opportunity for other companies. But I agree, it's kind of a temporary problem that a creditor must, or I don't know, double their bet on the company, give them more time. The government actually tried to do this through some development banks, but it's not all that broad. And I think that they were right. The creditor must actually bet on the company and not fight with the company. And to give us a perspective on that,
First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to help the Congress, help TMA. And also, I would like to congratulate the team, especially Grazi, for putting this together. It's an amazing event during a very, very difficult time. So, again, I'm very proud because of being one of the founders and almost 10 years ago. What a journey. Congratulations. Uh, the main aspect of this panel is related to the alternative plan. I tend to enjoy this aspect of the law. Why? Because it's important to have a check during the negotiation process. What is the most value-destroying aspect of a negotiation during an RJ? Too much time. Value is destroyed. So having a cross-check, I think that even the company sometimes would be thinking a little bit more about the process to take consideration, because there's always a risk if you overplay your hand, the creditors would or could potentially use that leverage. So I think, it's a good instrument, and not necessarily bad. I think it's good. But that brings us to the theme of the panel, which is valuation. One of the aspects of the creditors plan is what Nelly said, equitization or debt to equity conversion. The issue is it's phenomenal to the company. The company is going to get rid of all of the excess leverage. The company, as Nelly said, is ready for a turnaround. But what about the current shareholders? What are you going to be doing with them? It's very easy to say, well, they are the ones responsible for the mess that we're in, so they should be wiped out. This is a very typical statement during those processes. So I would argue that this is not just and fair because the company, even in distress, has the potential, I would emphasize the word, for a turnaround. And there's value into it. So it's not fair to say that the equity is zero. And more importantly, I think that if you're a creditor and you want to make money and you want to recover your amount or your value invested in the company, you should think of having the equity holder pushing forward to implement the turnaround. There's a huge information asymmetry. Most of the cases, the shareholders know way more about the company and the sector compared to the debt holders, right? So I think it's smart, economically speaking, to incentivize the equity holders by giving them a percentage of the remaining of the company after the equitization. Okay, so the overarching themes are there. So I'm not, flying away from the key question. What about valuation? So I would like to talk about, I used to be, a valuation professor at INSPER many, many years ago, more than I want to admit. But I won't bother you with the details. So first, I'd like to tell you what doesn't work. First, book value. Book value is a picture of the past, right? So it doesn't capture the turnaround potential. Second, which is a very, it's used by all the sell-side research investment banks, is the multiples. Multiples is great, but in a distressed situation, it's very bad. What EBITDA are you going to be using? Which profit? So I think that the preferred method to discuss and negotiate valuation should be the discounted cash flow. And why is that? Is because you can clearly lay out the business plan of the turnaround that Nelly mentioned and discount it. And I don't want to get into the details, but you need to have a discount rate that is not related to the company or to that moment. Otherwise, it's going to be immense, and then the equity value is going to be zero. But you need to have a kind of a comparable discount rate. Get the industry average leverage, get the industry beta, the industry average cost of debt, and then come up with a WACC. And then you can clearly discuss the business plan, and then you discount, and then you get something that it's just fair and is smart from an incentive perspective. So again, Nelly is the one that really knows about this because she actually worked with that. The only experience that I had and our firm had was negotiating equitization in the old law, quote unquote. So those are some comments that I had given that experience and from a methodological standpoint. So hopefully, I think that this component of the law is going to be beneficial to all. It's going to streamline the process, and we're going to have a clear and well-driven discussion with between the debt holders and the company. So thank you, André.
I thank you. And that's actually very enlightful because mainly in Brazil, you have a lot of family business, family companies, in which the partner, and you're talking about here big business, not only small business, but the big industry business, in which the partner is actually close to the day-to-day activity. So if you're completely correct, if the partner does not have any kind of incentive for a turnaround, he will just let the business go and say, okay, you can start an RJ. I have a lot of tax debt. I have workers here that I need to pay, and they all will just come before you. So you can have whatever remains of the company. So you're actually correct.
André, if I may.
Sure.
Renato, you bring up a really good point, which is a little different from Nelly's practice, I think. My practice is based in Miami, Florida. Florida, in many respects, is very similar to Brazil because I mostly represent family-owned companies. Significant in size, annual revenues of anywhere between 50 to 500 million a year, but we're talking families, right? And they're the only owners of the equity. So when in my past, I've had cases where I had, say, for example, 27 layers of equity, very large company. And so fulcrum security was really key. For the last 10 years, it's about the family. And, you know, I've thought for a long time, Renato, the point that you brought up, which was, you know, why are we, particularly in the United States under Chapter 11, why do we let the current owners, why do we let the current managers run the company, which is in Chapter 11, when really we're there in many respects because of usually poor decisions, not just market changes, but poor decisions. And then I think, well, it's because every other choice, every other alternative is worse than that. And that current equity does have a knowledge of the company, the good points, the bad points, the market in a way that if you brought in outside advisors, a lot of times don't have. You bring in a chief restructuring officer many times in companies that I deal with, and they're working with the current equity a great deal because they need to understand. The one thing that I would say, though, is with respect to valuation, is sometimes when you're dealing with family-owned companies, when you're dealing with folks who, particularly a patriarch who was really good at the growth of the company, but not really perhaps great at the managing of the company, they have unrealistic views of valuation. And I mostly represent debtor companies. I mostly represent family-owned companies. You have to, as the attorney or the professional representing the company, realize that they're unrealistic and that they need, in a very politic way, bring reality to the situation, because if you don't, it's failure. I was in a case of a very large shoe retailer, again, about $75,000 US in annual sales. And I negotiated, I was in that case not representing the company, I was representing the creditors committee, which is, you know, an adversary of the debtor, right? But you're negotiating the plan, and it's all about valuation, because when you represent a creditors committee, your goal is to get the highest distribution to the unsecured creditors. I don't deal in Nelly's case about debt to equity. It's really what percentage and how quickly can you get the money to the unsecured creditors. And unfortunately, in that case, the owner, very successful, over 150 stores, was saying, don't worry, I can get you a 40% distribution to the unsecured creditors paid out over 5 years. I hired professionals to represent the committee, financial advisors, who were like, well, you know, he could be right. It may be a turnaround. Well, unfortunately, we got the plan approved by the court, and at the end of the day, the company wasn't able to make all the distributions and actually went into a liquidation because the market was going down for this segment. So again, the idea is, one of my teaching tools for folks is always, particularly with family-owned companies, realize that you have to be extra careful about what they're saying because it's their life. They own this. It's a definition of who they are. And you got to sometimes just make the message that it's not as good as you think, or the future may not be as good as you think. So I like your discounted cash flow analysis. It just then becomes, when I'm a trial attorney, so the courtroom is where I live. It becomes the battle of the experts on that. If there's a disagreement about the cash flow analysis, the future, the discounted cash flow, I've been right in the middle of that argument in the courts in the US.
Hey, Chris, I know, thank you for bringing that, because I was looking at just one extreme, which is the equity should be wiped out, which is the norm. But you're right. The other extreme is also very, very bad, right? The ones that are created the problem, you know, in general, they need enhancement. Something needs to be changed. So if you have an equitization that the creditors would have 10%, 5% of the company without any change in governance, that's very likely recipe for disaster, because you're keeping everything the same. So it's a good point. The two extremes are bad. You need to have a negotiation around it.
And if I make just one more point, and it's very quick, it's under the bankruptcy code in the United States, the owner of a bankrupt company, an owner in Chapter 11, has to essentially repurchase the equity. And there's a whole process that I won't go into with that, but it's to continue to own the company past Chapter 11. The owner has to pay to keep the equity. And in many cases, that payment is what becomes the distributions to the, or a large segment of the distribution to the unsecured creditors. So it's great when you have an owner that's going to take his or her personal wealth in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and say, here, I want to keep my company. I have a belief in it. I have a faith in it. And it's really inspiring. But at the same time, it's just a distribution of the unsecured creditors. The owner will keep the owner 100% ownership of the company. And you just got to make sure you have that belief, that faith, that the fact that they're putting their own wealth to keep the ownership of the company is a big thing. But on another hand, you got to be careful, or exactly what Renato said, which is you want to be able to do a particular discounted cash flow analysis in order to, because this all has to be presented to the US Bankruptcy Court. It has to be approved in the disclosure statement and plan process. And you want to make sure that those numbers are carefully tested, because a lot of the times the distribution to unsecured creditors is over time, right? It's not, I'm giving you 40% 30 days after the plan is confirmed. It's a 5-year plan. And so you want to get, when you represent a creditors committee, you want to make sure that your constituency is going to get that full distribution. And you want the health of the company, because they continue in operation, they continue to sell things, people are continued to be employed, taxes are continued to be paid, et cetera. Vendors get paid, it's all good.
Yeah, and if I may just add one more thing, I mean, to add on to the point about it's really about the experts, right? And the truth is, there's not one black and white way on exactly the right way to value a company. There's obviously frameworks that are accepted, but the experts, the company can get an expert to testify to X, and I'm sure it will do a great job. And I'm sure there's another expert that will testify to Y, because there is a little bit of discretion in some of these valuation methodologies in terms of the assumptions you're making, et cetera. So this, also goes to the point of in Chapter 11, what ends up playing out is really a negotiation. And obviously there's the extreme cases where the company is completely wrong or the creditors are there, but there's a negotiation and discussion, because the ultimate goal of Chapter 11 is a consensual resolution. Despite the bad reputation that Chapter 11 has in terms of being litigious, and it can get that way if there are serious issues. But I think having those discussions and negotiations early on is key in terms of reaching a resolution, because it does erode value to have, a valuation fight can be very, can lead to protracted litigation, disclosure and appeals, et cetera. And it's not something that any company really wants to do, try to reorganize and come out better at the other end. So,
if I may just say one thing to that, is also know your court, all right? If you're going to have a valuation fight in the Southern District of New York, it's different than if you're going to have it in, name a more rural bankruptcy court in the United States. Know who your judge is. Know if you're going to have this valuation fight over a company, don't bring in mega financial advisor on a smaller case. Bring in somebody that before this judge has appeared before, is often my advice, or know somebody that you think the judge is going to listen to. So the strategy of a valuation fight, in many respects, are the personalities before the court. And it's a very careful process, because there's a lot of good professionals out there who can give good valuations, but who's going to be the most credible witness when they're on the stand? Who is this judge going to listen to and believe?
Yeah, I think we have the same problem here in Brazil also. If you're going to a bankruptcy court, you have to pay attention to the precedents that the court has and how the judge actually considers stuff, because we have a lot of, let's say, awkward decisions mainly about collateral that actually are considered in a certain manner in a certain region and a certain manner in another region. But Renato, please.
Just one comment here. Hearing Chris and Nelly discussing this issue in the U.S., I think that one of the main differences between the U.S. and Brazil is the fact that most of the banks in Brazil, they don't like equitization. So that's why this discussion, I can remember that we really discussed and implemented equitization in 4 or 5 cases. In my experience, it's very little. And all of those cases were bondholders. So I think that, with the secondary market increasing, we're going to see more and more the possibility of having cases in which equitization is going to happen. So it's theoretically, it's an important issue, but it, in practical terms, I think it's going to be more likely where, the jives of life and the bondholders are involved, because they would be willing to be equitized, right? And the banks, not so much.
Yeah, that's for sure a huge difference between here in Brazil and US. And you're right, like the negotiation process is actually flow in a different way when you're talking with bondholders and Brazilian banks. Brazilian banks, you're actually right. They want to know how long they're gonna have to wait until they receive the full amount of the financing or whatever transaction they have with the company, and that's correct. And I don't know, guys, if you have any final comments. I think we are running out of time here. Nelly, and if you...
No, thank you. I thought this was a great discussion, and I really appreciate being a part of it. Hopefully, a food for thought for everyone.
Yeah, sure. Sure it is. Thank you, Nelly, for your participation. Renato, I don't know if you have any final comments.
No, I think that we discussed.
Christopher, if you...
I just want to thank the organization. I want to thank Paiva. I've known him for 17 years. I think it's a lovely job with the TMA, Grazi, with the leadership, the whole leadership, the folks that you can't see behind us who have been put on a flawless program. André for being the moderator. Renato, as always, with respect to, I've always been impressed with every conference that I've ever heard you speak at, and once again I have. And Nelly, thank you very much. As one of the co-founders as well of TMA Brasil, I'm the gringo who will be here through good and bad, and I thank you, and I'm humbled by the invitation to be able to sit and talk with the three of you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for everyone that's watching. And that's it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.